to Kaya Biz. Kaya Biz with Kuletum on Kaya 959.
10 minutes to go before 7 o'clock. You're listening to Kaya Biz here on Kaya 959. Well, if you've recently read the Zondo Commission, you might look at their report and also have observed that the Commission repeatedly comments that directors of various captured state entities have not been properly held accountable for the massive damage that they caused to organizations that they were meant to serve. And if you consider this, it's a number of directors essentially who should be considered delinquent. But to help us understand what the standing and observation has been from the Institute of Directors in South Africa, we're joined by the CEO, Parmi Natesan, to give us some insight here. Parmi, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and good evening.
A very good evening to you. And Parmi, I guess in reflecting on the themes and highlights of the Zondo Commission, lots has been said about the financial services institutions, the individuals, the directors as well of these businesses that unfortunately were allies in terms of and parties within corrupting the state. But help us understand what the position and observations of the Institute of Directors has been.
Absolutely. I mean, the Zondo Report just lays it all out there in terms of the behavior of directors in both the public and private sector and how they contributed to this massive thing called state capture that we see. You know, directorship is an extremely serious and critical responsibility. Then directors make decisions that have an impact on not only organizations but all the stakeholders of those organizations. So it's so important that we have the right people serving as directors. People who are not only competent to serve, as in they have the knowledge, skills, and experience, but also people who are ethical and have the moral compass to serve without self-interest. And I think that's what we didn't see in these case studies.
And that raises concerns, right? Because then it actually helps us ask the questions, where have we gone wrong in terms of holding these directors to account?
Absolutely. And for a long time, we've been saying there isn't enough consequence management. So I think there's a couple of things. The first thing is, before we even get to consequence management, is how are directors getting appointed? And that's one big thing. You know, any other profession, generally, there's certain requirements that you have to meet. You need to have certain qualifications or experience, belong to a certain professional body, or have a certain designation in order to even apply. Whereas with directorship, unfortunately, it's anybody and everybody applies. And I'm not even clear what the vetting process is or could have been on some of these entities when you see the individuals and the findings against them. Was there a due diligence to check whether this individual is fit for purpose to serve as a director of these massive entities?
And you raise a valid point there, Parmi, right? Because one would assume these are individuals who are highly educated, astute business leaders, many of who actually have years of executive leadership. So remind us there, what would actually need to be taken into consideration before being considered as a director of some of these large SOEs and other financial institutions?
Yes, so there's so many things. We actually have what we call a director competency framework, which lists all the technical competencies and the personal competencies that you need to serve. You know, so it's not only about, as you mentioned, astute business person, executive experience, understanding of business and the economy, business judgment and all of these things, but then there's also personal competencies, ethics, courage to speak up against the flow if you believe something is wrong, you know, communication skills, the ability to read between the lines. Oftentimes as a director, it's not what's presented to you on the page, it's what's almost missing from the page, and it's just to ask the right questions to find out what you're not being told before you make a decision, you know?
Very true. And often taken for granted, I guess, when it comes to the appointment of certain directors. If we can perhaps shift from that, now that we've got a clearer understanding, to consequence management, what is it that we require to manage this adequately?
So at the moment in our law, we have the ability for someone to be declared delinquent under certain conditions, you know, gross abuse of power and that sort of thing. And we saw someone being declared delinquent last year. The challenge with delinquency is it takes someone else, and oftentimes it's a civil society organization, to have the time, money, and inclination to take an application to court. So it's not an easy process. It's not a quick process either. It's quite cumbersome and time-consuming. And you also have to have you have to know that you have sufficient evidence to be able to win a case, because the provisions of natural justice apply. Unfortunately, there is no sort of license to operate for directors like many other professions have. So let's take a doctor. If there's malpractice in relation to a doctor, the Medical Association of South Africa can remove that person's license to operate, and that person wouldn't be able to then practice as a director. At the moment, directorship in terms of the professional body or membership of, for example, the Institute of Directors is voluntary. You can serve as a director out there without being a member. So there is no real license to operate. And oftentimes when directors transgress, the public will ask, well, what is the Institute of Directors doing about it? Well, if they're not our members, because they didn't have to be our members in the first place, there's very little we can do to hold them to
Isn't
account.
that then something we should consider changing, if we should have all directors as members of the Institute of Directors of South Africa?
Absolutely, and it's something we've been talking about for a very long time. Because having people almost forced membership of an institute like ours or any other institute regulating the director profession will mean that, one, people are vetted in terms of the skills and experience, etc. Number two, they can be held to account against a code of conduct, and if they behave otherwise, their membership or designation can be removed. And then thirdly, also, they'd have to keep up with latest developments. So every profession has what they call CPD requirements, where you need to keep up with developments. And I guess the risk of not having a enforced professional body for directors is that we don't have all of those assurances.
Parmi, I'm also keen to, we've witnessed recent headlines where South Africa might face the threat of being grey-listed and hampering its opportunity to seek foreign direct investment from global institutions on the back of some of the outcomes regarding the Zondo Commission. Help us unpack, when we do see, I guess, the resurfacing of directors who have been implicated in the Zondo Commission, isn't there, I guess, further action that we can take to, I guess, red flag and highlight that, well, this particular individual was compromised during the Zondo Commission. Perhaps they shouldn't feature at a new institution in a new role of directorship. Does your organization have any powers there?
So we wouldn't have any powers as we're a voluntary body, but certainly the people making appointments, so nominations committees or whoever else is making appointments for directors should be doing detailed due diligences before they make appointments. They should be doing their research and finding out what someone's track record is before they make those appointments.
And I guess as members of civil society, stakeholders of entities and businesses, is there anything that we can do to raise those concerns?
I guess wherever we can is speak up in our positions, do our homework and speak up wherever we can. It's always difficult with these things, especially in the public sector where it seems like it's politically driven appointments. It feels like it's very little that we as the public can do. But then again, we as the public also should be holding our politicians to account via our vote and other things. Yeah.
Definitely. And I guess to close off with, Parmi, I'm assuming that the Institute of Directors also follows through with the companies or directors and companies law, and of course details that actually show and share details as to how directors should operate. Given that we have perhaps a new stream of leadership, are we seeing that there's a change in attitudes, in behaviors, and of course compliance to make sure that the King Code, corporate governance, and of course good ethics are being maintained in certain institutions?
I think it's difficult to say and maybe too early to say. Who would have known the extent of unethical behavior before we read all of these many pages of the Zondo Report? It's mind-blowing to read what's been happening. So I think it would be difficult to say. I certainly hope that we move in the direction of having ethical and effective leaders, because that's the only way this country and all of the organizations that operate in it is going to be able to be successful.
Certainly. Definitely needed, and I do hope that we do see some outcomes, positive outcomes that will be revealed in the short to medium term. Really appreciate your time this evening, Parmi.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. That's Parmi Natesan, the CEO for the Institute of Directors of South Africa, giving us some insight and, of course, reiterating some of the comments that were raised by the Zondo Commission, highlighting that directors of various captured state entities need to be held to account following the massive damage that they allowed and participated in damaging organizations that they were supposed to serve.
Kaya Biz with Gugulethu Mfuphi, Monday to Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. on Kaya 959.
On the streets, on the air.